Good evening to our viewers. We are now on our Learning Series event 4.0. I am Joshua Ablong, your moderator for tonight. This learning event series is brought to you by Dumaguete City Host Lions Club and Rotary Club of Dumaguete South. Now, as a reminder for our webinar house rules, this is a view-only mode. Participants' microphones are permanently on mute. The raise hand button is disabled, and later you may type in your questions in the Q&A box or on FB Live. Questions will be entertained at the end of the presentation. Now, at this juncture, allow me to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is an expert witness in the South China Sea arbitration case. He's a professor of biological sciences at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. He is notable for having two fish species named in his honor. He has worked in marine conservation and comparative phylogeography using population genetics with a special interest in the Philippines. He is also the coordinator for the IUCN Global Marine Species Assessment, completing the first global review of every marine vertebrate species and of selected marine invertebrates and marine plants to determine a conservation status and possible extinction risk for about 20,000 marine species. So, ladies and gentlemen, our friends and our viewers, kindly welcome our speaker for tonight, Dr. Kent E. Carpenter.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Attorney, for that very kind introduction. Welcome to everybody who is watching this learning event on various internet platforms. Now, as we all know, this seminar is prompted by the recent proposal to build a 174-hectare reclamation zone off the coast of Dumaguete City. This reclamation project will cause many obvious impacts to the marine environment that are very easily understood. In this webinar, I would like to focus on some of the not so obvious impacts that are illustrated by this photo that I chose for my title slide. This so-called suction hopper dredger was a primary instrument in the very controversial island building activity in the West Philippine Sea, where the natural color of the water is a very deep blue because the water naturally is very clear, except of course in shallow water where the water is also very clear, but you can see the bottom. The upper part of this photo shows the natural color of the water where the dredger is in. And if it were not dredging, it would all be blue. Please keep in mind during this webinar, the whitish color of the water, essentially the natural deep blue color turned to whitish because of the sediments spilling into the water from the island building activity. This murky water, where once there was very clear water, is representative of the many potential extended impacts of the so-called smart city that is proposed off the Dumaguete coast. Now, first, I'd like to say that I have a lot of firsthand experience diving in the marine habitats around Dumaguete City. I've been diving in these environments for over 45 years. I was a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, assigned to the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources in Manila in the research division, where I helped to initiate a coral reef research unit. And as part of my job, I was tasked with trying to understand the extent of coral reef fisheries resources. And very early on in this, I was able to collaborate with Dr. Alcala. Dr. Angel Alcala has been my mentor for many years. He was my mentor during my early period in the Peace Corps. And we examined a very early I not shared my
I,
screen here?
I'm sorry, Dr. Carpenter, would you like to share your screen?
Oh, sorry about that. I knew I was forgetting something here. Can you see that now?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I apologize for that. Okay, so as I was saying, I was able to collaborate with Silliman University very early on as a Peace Corps volunteer, and Dr. Alcala was my mentor. One of the things that he did share with me at that time was he took me around to many of the areas in front of Dumaguete City and showed me some of the very diverse habitats here, including habitats that house very unique sea snakes, many coral species, many fish species, and so on. And this is true actually in the present day. If you spend the time to go out to the environs in front of Dumaguete City now, you'll see that it is a very vibrant coral reef habitat in the area proposed for the reclamation area. Now, we know that the area around Dumaguete is highly diverse because it is in the Coral Triangle. So we know that the Coral Triangle, for a very long time, we've known that the Coral Triangle, which includes the area of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, and of course the Philippines is at the apex of the Coral Triangle. We've known that it has the highest concentration of marine species of any place in the world. This is the so-called Amazon River Basin of the marine world because it has a peak of diversity in this area. So we know this because for many marine organisms, including algae and corals, many invertebrates, and most of the fish groups have their peak of species richness right in the Coral Triangle. So we know this because we see species richness increasing from west to east in the Indian Ocean and reaching a peak in the Coral Triangle, and the same in the Pacific Ocean, where species richness increases from east to west. So this particular map here is a range overlap map. It's a heat map that shows the highest concentration of coral species, designated by the reds and the oranges here, as reaching a peak in the Coral Triangle. So this is actually true for most marine groups, reaching a peak of diversity in the Coral Triangle. Now, I decided to study the patterns of marine biodiversity in the Coral Triangle in the early part of the 2000s. And I had as a basis for this study nearly 3,000 maps of a range of species, all the way from algae all the way up to marine mammals, including many invertebrates, mostly comprised of marine fishes. And when we were able to look at the maps of these in a GIS, a Geographical Information System computer program, which gained a lot of interest and a lot of widespread use in the early part of the 2000s. When we looked at this in a GIS program and were able to overlay all of these 3,000 species maps, we found a very curious pattern. And this pattern was that the peak of diversity within the Coral Triangle reaches a peak in the central part of the Philippines. So the central part of the Philippines, according to this subset of species, reached a peak in the central part of the Philippines. So because the Coral Triangle, we know, is a center of marine biodiversity, in order to highlight the idea that the Philippines actually is a center within this center of marine biodiversity, we called it the center of the marine biodiversity. Now, initially, this was a very controversial finding because most marine biogeographers actually thought that the peak of marine biodiversity would be found in Indonesia. And in fact, since this study was done, there's been a couple of independent studies that have verified the Philippine epicenter of marine biodiversity, including one study that actually set out to disprove the center of the center in the Philippines using coral reef species, but in fact, instead of disproving it, it actually showed also the peak in the central part of the Philippines. And then since these independent studies, we've actually gone back and looked at all the available maps for marine species, including mostly marine fishes. And these are independent maps produced by experts. And again, we showed without any doubt that the central part of the Philippines has the highest concentration of species within the coral triangle, and by extension, of course, the highest concentration of marine species in the world. So this is a very important natural heritage that all Filipinos should be very proud of. The fact that they are in the country that houses the highest concentration of marine species of any place on the planet. And if you happen to live in the Visayan region of the Philippines, you also have another reason to be very proud, because one of the studies we did based solely on coral reef fishes showed that the highest 1% of concentration, so species per unit area of coral reef fishes, actually occurs in this yellow area here, which you see is in the central part of the Philippines in the Visayan region. So we can call this essentially, in terms of coral reef fishes, the center of the center of the center. Now, there are other parts of the Philippines, such as the Verde Island Passage, which actually has other peaks of diversity based on a wider range of marine species. But the Visayan region, including Dumaguete, has the peak in the world peak in terms of numbers of species of coral reef fishes, at least on a historical basis. Okay, so the question then to us here is, what will happen to this slice of extreme marine biodiversity in the Dumaguete area if this 174 hectare smart city project goes forward? And the way I'd like to examine this is by looking at the impacts of island building that were examined through the course of the West Philippine Sea court case. Now, you may have heard that there was a big court case that was held in the Peace Palace in The Hague in the Netherlands. This court case was heard by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is the oldest world court in the world. Started around the turn of at the end of the 19th century. And of course, the Philippine government during this court case actually argued that the island building activities that occurred in the West Philippine Sea were contravened the treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, I know this because, as was mentioned earlier, I was the expert witness for the Philippine government during these court proceedings in The Hague. Some of you may recognize Justice Carpio. I had the honor of sitting next to him throughout most of these proceedings. He is also actually a very avid marine environmentalist. But you probably are most familiar with this case, the Republic of the Philippines versus the People's Republic of China, as a territorial dispute. So under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Philippines should own a large part of the South China Sea. This is the so-called West Philippine Sea. But the People's Republic of China actually claims most of this area that not only belongs, according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to the Philippines, but to other countries as well. Now, what you probably are not as familiar with, because the territorial dispute is really the largest part and the most known part about this court case, is that there was actually a fairly large environmental component. And this is because the PRC actually was undergoing some very destructive fishing activities in the West Philippine Sea, and also island building activities in the South China Sea. So these island building activities are essentially the same thing as the so-called Reclamation project that is proposed for off of Dumaguete City. Reclamation is actually sort of a misnomer. It's there's actually not reclaiming any land. It's actually more land replacement activity, because you're essentially building land where there was none previously. So part of this case that we presented to the tribunal of the of the Permanent Court of Arbitration centered around the idea that fragile ecosystems require protection. And according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, fragile ecosystems require protection. So all of the signatories of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which actually includes most of the countries of the world, including the Philippines and the People's Republic of China, agree that fragile marine ecosystems should be protected. Coral reefs, we argued, are fragile ecosystems, and this is actually fairly well established because of the very delicate symbiotic relationship between the corals themselves and the essential photosynthetic algae that live inside these corals. So these photosynthetic dinoflagellates are actually a symbiont of the corals. Because they're photosynthetic, they require sunlight in order to survive. And if they can't survive, then they leave the corals. And if this happens, bleaching occurs, and typically the coral will die. So the symbiotic relationship is absolutely necessary in most cases. And because of that, it requires clear water. Clear water is necessary not only because of the need for photosynthetic activity, but also because if there are lots of sediments in the water, then it will essentially smother corals, which are living on the bottom. If a coral reef is disrupted, then it could take decades to recover, particularly if the disturbance continues. So one of the examples that we presented to the Philippine Court of Arbitration was one of the submerged reefs. So there were essentially 7 submerged reefs in the West Philippine Sea that were essentially destroyed because of island building activity. One of these reefs is the so-called Mischief Reef, found in the West Philippine Sea. Mischief Reef looks like this under natural conditions. So you see the brownish areas here are the reef flats. On the inside of the lagoon, you have very vibrant coral reef and seagrass beds shown by these lighter blues and greens. The most diverse part of the reef here is actually on the outside edge, which you see mostly outlined in white because this is where the waves break. But this outside area is where the most vibrant part of the coral reef actually exists. And you notice that this water here looks actually mostly black. It's a very, very deep blue. And it's a very, very deep blue because, as I said, it occurs in typically very, very clear water. Now, just to give you an idea of the size of Mischief Reef, the diameter here is about 8.5 kilometers wide. And as we know, the reclamation area proposed for Dumaguete is about 7 kilometers long. So this gives you an approximate scale relative to Dumaguete reclamation project of what was happening in terms of Mischief Reef during the island building activities. Now, this is January of 2012, but this color is also indicative of what Mischief Reef looked like just prior to the island building activity. Now, island building activity actually started in the West Philippine Sea in the early part of 2015. The court case was to take place in November of 2015. So the PRC rushed to try to build a lot of islands over the submerged reefs. And as you can see, these white areas here are essentially where sand and gravel and ground up corals and whatnot are deposited on the very shallow part of the reef, causing the shallow parts of the reef to essentially become land. Now, one of the things you'll also notice about this photograph after the initiation of island building activities in March of 2015, you see this very whitish color of the water here, and this represents, of course, the sediments that were introduced into the water column because of the island building activity. So the suction dredgers, the so-called cutter suction dredgers that were used for this island building activity are represented by this one here. So this is a very large ship. You can see here's the bridge. If you can see, there's actually two people standing on this area of the ship. So this is a very large ship. And at the very front of the ship, in the bow of the ship, is a drill with a very large rotating head on the front with metal teeth and holes in it that can introduce water into a pump system here. Now, I'll show you a diagram of how this suction dredger actually works. What happens is the drill is dropped to the bottom of the seafloor in fairly shallow water. What happens is this drill bit essentially grinds against corals and coral and rock and sand and produces a slurry because water is introduced into the drill, and the slurry is sucked into the drill and is passed through a floating hose that floats over the top of the water, and then the end of the hose occurs in shallow reef habitats where the slurry of sand and water is deposited, the water drains away, and what's left is a mound of sand, creating newly formed land over what was once a vibrant coral reef shallow habitat. Now, this is the obvious impacts of island building or land replacement over a reef. You essentially destroy whatever is under that land. That's obvious. But what's not so obvious is what happens in the water column adjacent to this land that is built. This is a cross section of a typical coral reef. You have a shallow area, which is the reef flat. This is the area, because it's shallow, that is covered over with the sediments that are deposited on it during a land replacement activity. Typically to seaward, you have a very viable and biodiverse coral reef in the deeper areas, and also shallow areas have often very viable coral reefs and seagrasses as well. So this is the area that is essentially covered, smothered, and destroyed by the reef building activity. And then what you see is the sediments causing destruction in the adjacent areas. So again, suspended sediments caused by this dredging activity essentially block out the sun that is required for the photosynthesis of the corals, and also smothers the corals because the sediments settle on the coral. So adjacent habitats where the land is actually built are harmed and destroyed. I will say that in the case of the island building activity that's proposed for off the coast of Dumaguete, with a land replacement activity, we're not sure what sort of landfill will be used, or whether or not they will use suction dredger hoppers, or if they will try to use land-derived fill. If they use land-derived fill, you will still get sediments that leach out into the surrounding water. So what will happen is still a lot of sediments that will leach out and potentially destroy areas that are surrounding the actual area that is made into new land. Now, many dredgers were used in this island building activity in the West Philippines Sea. You can see many dots here. This is a close-up of one of the areas early on in the island building activity, where you had many dredgers pouring out land onto these shallow reef flats. By April, just only a month after the last slide, you can see that the entire western part of Mischief Reef was transformed into a new land area where before there was no land whatsoever. And you can also see these extensive sedimentation plumes that are leaching out into the coral habitats of the lagoon. Again, this is an 8.5 kilometer area. By June of 2015, the entire island building activity actually was essentially complete. As you can see, there's still a lot of sediments in the entire area, and that are essentially harming corals beyond where the actual reef is has been covered over. So Mischief Reef, even many months after the actual land building activity was completed, you still see lots and lots of sedimentation outside and inside, outside the lagoon and inside the lagoon. And this is, of course, because of the natural wave action and current action against the reef that leaches out the sediments from the newly created landform. So I'll zero in on the eastern part of Mischief Reef here in order to show you the extensive sediment plume that occurs in this part many months after the island building is actually ended. This is what that area looked like before island building occurred with vibrant seagrass and coral reef habitats. And now it's essentially smothered over, and adjacent habitats are continually stressed because of sedimentation and surrounding waters. Now, of course, the engineers will tell you that all we need to do is to harden the coastline to prevent sedimentation from occurring. But in fact, this coastline was also hardened, but you still have extensive leaching of sedimentation into the nearby areas. Again, this is the outer reef, which is the most vibrant part of the coral reef. And you can see that the sedimentation plume actually occurs several hundred meters offshore, despite the fact that the shoreline has been hardened. Now, the science of what happens during dredging and when sediment disturbances occur is very well known. It's very well documented. There was a review of all the documentation of this in 2012, and the concepts are actually quite easy. When you have lots of sediment quite easy to understand, when you have lots of sediments in the water column, you have a very high stress to the corals. And if that high stress occurs for a very long period of time, you can have mortality or sublethal effects. In normal times, over a coral reef, you might have a very strong rainfall that causes some sedimentation to occur in the waters around a coral reef. These murky waters are a very low intensity of stressor, and they typically only last for hours or days at most. And corals are actually quite resilient and can survive low stress, short duration types of impacts of sedimentation. But in the case of island building activities, in the case of land replacement activities, typically the amount of sediments that are in the water is very high, the stress is very high, and because it takes a long time to build islands and to build reclamation areas, this sedimentation remains in the water for very long periods of times, weeks and months. And in this case, you have a near 100% mortality of the corals and the coral ecosystem. In the case of the South China Sea, we've seen that the duration actually of the sedimentation actually occurs for years, and as a consequence, the near new island areas of the coral reefs are still under a lot of stress and probably completely destroyed. Now, there are a lot of questions remaining about what will happen if we go through with this land reclamation project. It's I got this particular figure off of the internet, and it shows the amount of hectares of seagrass and corals and mangroves that will be directly covered over, the percent that will be directly covered over by the actual land replacement activity. It proposes that perhaps the adjacent areas won't be totally lost, but if you look at the science of sedimentation after dredging, I would hypothesize that all of the corals and seagrasses adjacent to these areas will be essentially destroyed because of the prolonged impact of sedimentation. Even the areas off of Silliman Beach, which are not going to have any land reclamation areas, these very vibrant habitats that have been studied for many years by Silliman University will be destroyed, I hypothesize, because of the extended impacts of sedimentation. And if there are very strong currents that occur because of weather events, you could get potential damage to even further away habitats such as the prime diving areas to the south of Dumaguete City and also the Tanyan Straits as well. Now, one potential important extended impact that accompanies the very murky waters created by this land replacement activity are the international implications for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Philippine government argued very strenuously that the land island building activities was essentially an environmental atrocity. Many people will say that, well, but wait a minute, now the Philippines has reclaimed land around Manila Bay and the areas around Cebu, but that's just not the same as the island building activity that occurred in the West Philippine Sea, and also not so for Dumaguete either, because of the current vibrant coral reefs that occur off of Dumaguete. Manila Bay and Cebu essentially had very highly impacted environments with no real viable coral reefs in those areas when reclamation or island or land replacement occurred. Even more so for Dumaguete because it's in an area of very high biodiversity. It's essentially a Philippine heritage because of this high diversity. So the question in my mind really is if we don't respect the environmental claims of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, why should there be respect for the territorial claims of this PCA also, which agreed with the Philippines that there was an environmental harm done in the area of the South China Sea, in the area of the West Philippine Sea, as well as the fact that the PRC was claiming a territory that essentially belongs to the Philippines. So I, of course, respect the right for anyone to want to support the idea of a smart city based on the idea of economic development. The idea of economic development is good, but some alternative perhaps should be found to the proposed land replacement activity because very valuable habitats will be essentially lost. So the environmental costs for Dumaguete are quite high. This is not the same as reclaiming land around Manila Bay or Cebu. And of course, then this is not to mention the potential international implications. Think about it for just a moment. Who will be the happiest to see the Philippines doing essentially what the Philippines said should not be done in the West Philippine Sea? And who will lose the most if the international community no longer respects the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration because the Philippines is essentially doing the same thing that the PRC did in the West Philippine Sea. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration agreed with both the territorial and the environmental claims of the Philippines. What will the international community think? Well, I invite you to be the judge, and I thank you very much for your attention. And I will, you've heard all the questions in my mind about this proposed land replacement activity, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions that you as the ultimate judges in the court of public opinion may still have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter, for that very informative lecture. At this juncture, we have a number of questions in our Q&A box. The first question that we have here is, what are the possible human impacts on the disturbance to the concentration of the marine species that will surely occur with the intended reclamation?
Well, of course, I've highlighted the idea of biodiversity, but as you all know, there are many communities right along the Dumaguete City waterfront that depend on the marine resources there. If we go ahead with this land reclamation project, this land replacement project, then the human impacts will be large because many of the people who rely on the nearshore habitats for food and for resources, this will undoubtedly be disrupted for a very long period, if not permanently, because of the change in the depth contours that will occur as a result of the land reclamation project. In essence, the people won't be able to use those habitats and are not likely to be able to use the new habitats that are formed from the new land replacement activity.
The next question, sir, is to get an idea of the potential damage this will bring, do you know what the extent of the damage was done by the Cebu reclamation?
I have studied those habitats for many, many years, since even before the reclamation project. I know that the area within there was already very highly disturbed before land reclamation occurred. Um, um, I know that these areas were probably not very productive because of the extent of the extent of the degradation of the habitats already, because it's in an area close to Cebu City and was very highly impacted by shipping and the proximity to an urban center. I don't know for certain exactly how much was disturbed, but it certainly on a per unit area will not be nearly as much as what will occur off of Dumaguete City.
The next question is, what can you say about the plan to avoid the areas with marine life and just reclaim the areas that don't have much marine life?
Again, I would fall back on the the science that we know what will happen what will happen in areas that the land is replaced. There will be lots of sediments introduced into the water, and this will destroy the corals and the vibrant habitats in adjacent areas. So no matter where you try to build a large amount of land, in front of Dumaguete City, you're going to impact ultimately the areas that supposedly don't have lots of biodiversity. I would like to remind everybody that every environment is a continuum of different. Every ecosystem is in a continuum of different environments. So even muddy bottom areas that seemingly don't have a lot of marine biodiversity are in some way supporting the areas that do have a lot of marine biodiversity. So if you disrupt any of the habitats, even the ones that are seemingly unproductive, you're still going to have a substantial impact on adjacent seemingly high biodiversity areas.
Thank you for that, sir. The next question is it right to assume that the concern of this island building activity does not only endanger the coral reefs that are highlighted on the plans that are shown, but also the slope that limits this island.
Most definitely. The area that will probably be impacted the most is the slope. Um, so the sedimentation will directly impact it, and the topography of the bottom will be changed by these new lands. Typically, when that happens, you change the normal currents around an area, and that can also have severe impacts on the natural environments of an area.
In relation to that question, the next question is how big can these sediment plumes be? Will this affect neighboring towns?
Potentially, yes. So, as we all know, weather events in the present day are becoming extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. They're becoming more prevalent. Um, and as a consequence, we can expect that during the course of the actual reclamation or land replacement activity, that there will be an intersection of extreme weather events. This could cause large dumping of sediments into the adjacent waters and potentially move up or down the coast depending upon prevailing currents and prevailing weather, and do great harm to areas further afield. I'm not an expert in oceanography, so I can't say exactly how far, but I would hypothesize that the probability of this happening because of extreme weather events is fairly high.
Here's another question from another attendee. The attendee is asking, there are many people who lack appreciation of the importance of the corals and seagrass. What can we tell these people to convince them of the importance that they play in our communities?
Well, again, I would rely on the immediate impacts of humans. So the seagrasses, the corals are important for livelihoods. They're important for subsistence, and um, uh, and they also are important for the tourism industry that, as we know, Dumaguete is very famous for. The tourism industry will not survive or cannot survive if it doesn't have something good to see in the underwater realm. So a lot of tourism in the Getty area is based on the vibrant habitats. So I would say that if you try to say that these habitats are not very important in the overall scheme of things, you have to look further about the entire economy of the area that relies a lot on tourism, subsistence, and other sorts of activities that are directly related to the habitats in the Dumaguete City marine area.
Here's another question, and this is very interesting because I believe this is in relation to how fast an island can be built. There are a lot of promises being made by our local politicians who say that this will provide jobs, especially during the pandemic where many businesses are closed. And so essentially, a project of this magnitude, people would be asking, how long does it typically take for an island to be built, based on your observations on what happened in the West Philippine Sea. Normally, an island of this magnitude, 174 hectares, to your mind, how fast would that be? How long will it take?
So in the West Philippine Sea, it happened very, very quickly because they had dozens of these huge suction cutter dredgers, okay, dozens of them. And they were able to accomplish, essentially 10 kilometers of island replacement, of land replacement on these submerged reefs in a matter of 6 or 7 months. But think of it, most of the work was done by people who live or are subside on these boats. If something like this is going to happen fairly quickly, what will happen is all the jobs will go to people who um, uh, come in on the boats that are used for dredging. If dredging is used for the island building activity in Dumagetti, I don't know a lot of the answers to that. It's very hard to answer that question. Um, but most likely, the economics of this will help local people from Dumagetti for a certain period of time. But after that, it will be gone. And probably a lot of the jobs will actually be people who are imported that actually know the business of island building. So I don't really know. I'm not an economist. I can't really speak to what will happen. But in my mind, um, the idea that you're going to be creating a lot of jobs for people in Dumagetti in the short term doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't know. I'm not an economist. I would leave that for somebody who knows this a little bit better, but I'm just guessing, really.
Yeah, I think this is related to the first question, sir. It now goes into the source of the materials that will be used for island building. The attendee is asking whether local contractors want to know if recent island building activities of China ever involved sand coming from land. Some have quarry and trucking businesses and want to know if there's opportunity for them to earn here. How many people can operate these ships? Our mayor said we can employ a lot of people during the reclamation stage. I think this is really a very interesting question, sir, because yes, again, it goes into the economics of this. Based on your observation and your experience on what happened on the West Philippine Sea, um, where did they get the materials to build these islands? Did they get it from a mainland somewhere, or did they get it right from the seabed or the seafloor?
Almost all of it was right from the seafloor. The only parts that came from afar were actually the buildings and whatnot that were built on the island after the island was created. So all of those sediments were dredged from the seafloor and deposited on the shallow reef flats. So none of this actually was imported from land. Now, what will happen in Dumagetti, I don't know. I don't know if that has actually been addressed. There are two potential sources, either dredging, which will be a lot of ships coming in, and the people who know how to run those ships will do most of the work. Or you could also be quarrying the land and dumping land on top of the shallow areas of the ocean. But if you think of how much land would be required to be quarried to fill 174 hectares, that's a lot of land. That's a lot of land that will potentially actually make a lot of Dumagetti really ugly because they're going to be making the quarries everywhere for this land. You're going to be destroying natural habitats. You're going to be destroying areas that might be beautiful now on land. And in my mind, that would also cause a huge problem with the roads around Dumagetti as well. Think of hundreds of these big trucks that are probably going to be imported from Cebu or Manila with their drivers to transport a land that's quarried somewhere in the Dumagetti area and then transported to the water. Um, Either scenario is, in my mind, going to be ugly. You dredge the bottom of the ocean and deposit it, it's going to cause lots of problems. You destroy a lot of the beauty of Dumagetti by expanding huge quarries. I don't really know, but there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered, obviously, before any sort of an environmental impact assessment can be made about this proposed land replacement activity.
Essentially, our reference here would be what happened in the West Philippine Sea, and again, this is in relation to jobs that are being promised by our local politicians, particularly our mayor, that this will generate a lot of jobs. Now, based on what you've seen, Dr. Carpenter, would these reclamation project require special skills that would be imported somewhere, or can these easily be done by people who are in Dumaguete?
Well, think about it. How many suction cutter dredgers are there in Dumaguete? How many people in Dumaguete have even seen a suction dredger? Um, these are maritime specialties that would need to be imported in the short term. How to deploy the pipes, how to decide on what part of the seabed will be dredged in order to deposit it in the shallow areas. All of those are specializations that probably will be imported. And where are these sections going to be coming from? My understanding, I don't know. I don't want to point any fingers, but I think everybody here knows that probably a lot of the work will be imported from abroad. And so there will be jobs for local people in Dumaguete, but most likely it will be supporting the ships that are going to be doing the specialized work. So supplying food, supplying support, that sort of activity would probably be most likely the sort of activity that would create jobs in the short term to support the dredgers if the same model for the West Philippine Sea is imported to Dumaguete.
There it goes. So essentially, because these are highly specialized jobs, dredging and suctioning of sand, perhaps from the seafloor, essentially this would require foreign workers who are already skilled or technical, who have the technical know-how to do it. So at any rate, there are still a number of questions here. Given that you are a world authority on marine biodiversity, if this reclamation happens in Dumaguete, would you consider it a major, local, or regional species extinction event?
Populations will be extirpated or destroyed locally here. There are actually a number of species that occur in this region that are only known from this region. Um, I would uh, I would suspect that local extirpations will occur, but it's really unsure whether or not there will be any global extinctions. But for in terms of the local biodiversity, I think local extinctions are a bad thing, um, and particularly in a part of the world that is supposed to have the highest concentration of marine biodiversity in the world. Um, you will lose a lot more biodiversity than in other places. Even the West Philippine Sea doesn't have as high a biodiversity as we have right here in Dumaguete. So you'll lose more per unit area here than they did in the West Philippine Sea.
Sir, when we talk about local extinction, how wide would that be? Like, would that be in the immediate coastlines of Dumaguete, or would it also affect coastlines or areas in neighboring islands?
It's not again, you would need an extreme weather event, I think, in order to impact, let's say, Apple Island. The probability of this spilling over to Apple Island, I don't think it's highly probable. But areas just south of Dumaguete, yes, it could happen. Like in terms of local species being extirpated, the best example I have is in Banilad. Now, Banilad is a marine protected area that will be covered over by this reclamation project if it occurs. And in Bonilad, there's a very special sea snake. It's the turtle-headed sea snake. And this sea snake is really, I know of it really only occurring in Bonilad. That's the only place I've ever seen it. So my guess would be that the turtle-headed sea snake will go locally extinct. I could be wrong. Dr. Alcala might correct me here, but the only place where I've seen this is right in this special area in Bunny Lab. And I know that it's a very unique sea snake. I don't know how widespread it is, but I know that that's one potential for a local extinction of a species that is very unique. And if I know anything about Dr. Alcala, he probably, or his group probably proposed the Bunny Lad Marine Protected Area specifically because of this very unique sea snake that's there. So I could be wrong. I'm doing a little bit guessing here, basing my experience in these habitats. Um, but that's my guess, that there will be some local extinctions of very special marine organisms.
Now, here's another question here. The mayor says that one option is to transfer or replant the corals. Is this really a viable option?
There's been a lot of studies about that, and the answer to that is that it's not very viable in my mind. The cost of replacing, of digging up corals and bringing them to a different area where they probably won't survive. When you think about it, the areas that have corals already around this area have corals because they naturally survive there. If you were to pick up the corals, number one, there's a high probability they will die just from the extraction process. And then when you bring them to another area that already has a coral reef, you're essentially just adding something that's already there. And so, in my mind, transplanting the corals is number one, very costly, very likely to result in high mortality of the corals as you try to transplant them. And number three, probably not very useful to any area that you are transplanting them to. Because if there's not corals already in an area, it's not likely that those corals will survive anyhow.
Now, the next question has something to do with some sort of a spillover effect of this reclamation. It has something to do with the sediment plume that would be generated. The attendee is asking, do you think that the sediment plume that would be generated by massive reclamation in Dumaguete can severely affect Apo Island, judging from what you have observed in the West Philippine Sea?
I would say probably not affecting Apo Island. I could be wrong. If there's an extreme weather event that picks up a lot of sediments and the plume goes directly toward Apo Island, there could be an effect, but I think the probability is fairly low. Um, Most of the effects will be in adjacent, directly adjacent reef habitats or areas that are, say, several hundred meters to a couple of kilometers maybe away. And I'm
I
guessing,
think, yeah,
purely guessing.
I think this question was partially answered a while ago, but attendee is just the attendee is just curious if, in comparison, can you give us an example how much sand will be needed for this reclamation? Like, will it entail, let's say, the whole of Mount Talinis?
Probably not all of the mountain, but I haven't done the math. And if you can, probably some people that are in the audience can probably calculate the area of 174 hectares. Probably the depth that will be required is probably on average, I'm guessing again, maybe 10 to 20 meters. Let's just say 20 meters to be safe. So let's just say that you need 174 square hectare, or 174 hectares, and a depth of at least 20 meters on average. And again, I'm guessing, um, of land that will be needed in order to actually affect an emergent land area. So somebody with a quick mathematical mind and a calculator can probably tell us what volume that would be and what is the volume of the mountain. and, and you'll come up with an answer for that. But I think that there will be severe impacts on land and also the infrastructure of Dumagetti if an attempt is made to use local land sources for the fill of these of the proposed 174 hectare area.
The next question is more on the weighing of the advantages and disadvantages of this project. The attendee is asking, do you think the proposed island building in Dumaguete is more of a disadvantage to the city or an advantage, taking into consideration its environmental impact over its economic gain?
Well, think about it. Dumaguete is a not a really big city, right? I mean, we don't even have a traffic signal yet in Dumaguete City. Think of how many traffic signals there are in Cebu or Manila, and think of the amount of land that was reclaimed there compared to what was reclaimed here. Um, I don't. I mean, to me, the economics of it don't make sense. But again, I'm not an economist, so I can only guess. I can only guess. And from what I've heard from other people saying is that Dumaguete really doesn't need such a huge um, reclamation area in order to survive. Certainly not in the short term. I I'm a biologist. I'm a conservation-minded person, so obviously my mind is going to be geared more towards um, the the um, the environment. But I've talked to other people, some very respectable people in Dumaguete City, who are in favor of this because they think it will be a big boon to the economy of the area. In my mind, it's not the right economic development plan. Um, I've heard people say that there's not a lot of extra land around Dumaguete, but I see lots of potential for developing certain areas of around Dumaguete City as a smart city within the city rather than outside the city. So I think you can come up with a solution. I hear people saying that there is no land, but I don't I question that. I think that you can always find a way of building a smart city within Dumaguete to the advantage of everybody without using foreign vessels to create land over an area that is a very unique and special habitat. That just doesn't make sense to me. I don't see it.
The next viewer is asking, there is always a comparison that is made with Cebu, especially with regards island building. They were able to do it, why can't we? When you said something like not in Dumaguete, what can we show to them as reference or proof to strengthen our stand?
Well, Dumaguete has, in their marine environments, has very, very beautiful coral reefs. So they're going to be destroying coral reefs and seagrass beds in Dumaguete. In Cebu, that land reclamation area was in an area that was very highly impacted because of shipping, because of proximity to Cebu City. So essentially, you were taking a dead environment and filling it with land. And that's not the case for Dumaguete. Dumaguete has very valuable marine habitats. Um, Go out there, dive off of Piapi. Some very good friends of mine, my neighbors went to Piapi off of Piapi, went diving there because they were curious about what would be covered over by the reclamation project. They saw nice coral reefs. They saw huge sea turtle, a very friendly sea turtle that was very, very big, and other sea turtles that were there as well. So these are the types of things that tourists like to see, that people living in nearby areas use for their own marine resources. And these are the areas that will be destroyed because of this island building or land replacement activity. Um, Not so in Dumaguete. People weren't dependent upon those environments in Cebu because there was really nothing of value there.
Now, I think the next question is in relation to what you have seen in the West Philippine Sea. The attendee is asking, right after China created these islands, what other structures or facilities does China usually introduce into the area based on what you've seen?
Well, huge airports. I mean, you have airports that were created on these islands that are some of the biggest in the world. I mean, bigger than some of the largest international airports. And these are military installations. And much of the buildings that are built on these new islands are military in nature, simply a way of asserting control over an area that is claimed by the Philippines and other countries as well.
Now, the next question is again in relation to what the mayor has been saying. The attendee is asking, what does the mayor mean when he talks about integrating the corals? Is it even possible to do this?
Um, I don't know what the mayor was saying when he said that. I, I, the island building activity will destroy the corals, plain and simple. And how you could integrate the corals in that is not at all, in my mind, possible. Um, but fortunately, I believe you're going to be hosting the mayor in a few days in this, at some point in this series, and I highly recommend that the attendee ask the mayor himself. Um, um, but keeping in mind what what the biologists have said as well.
Here's another question. Our Philippine Reclamation Authority said the location of the islands. I'm not really sure, sir, if you can answer this one, but the attendee is asking, our Philippine Reclamation Authority said the location of the islands will affect navigation and anchorage. Uh, are you seeing that in our China-built islands? How does that happen?
Well, in a way, the islands that were built in the West Philippine Sea actually help naval shipping activities because they create areas where ships are going to be quite safe and docking areas and things like that. I think off of Dumaguete, um, they're keeping corridors open for shipping to occur, but I haven't really studied that at all. So you're right. I don't think I can actually answer that question intelligently.
Here's another question. Can you describe how much we will lose in terms of the services that a coral reef ecosystem in the center of the center provides to us once this reclamation or island building project begins?
Well, I look forward to more people trying to answer this question. I have not tried to answer it myself. We can estimate the amount of coral reef that will be lost, the amount of seagrasses beds that will be lost, and we can also estimate the goods and services that come directly from those particular habitats, in terms of direct food, in terms of tourism, and many other aspects as well. I don't have the answer to that right off the tip of my tongue, but I think that there probably are some people working on trying to calculate that, and try to understand. I'm sorry, I don't have those numbers available to me, but it will be, I think, probably substantial.
Another one is asking, you mentioned dozens of ships, perhaps pertaining to the West Philippine island reclamation or island building projects conducted by China. How often do these ships dock to refuel, for example? We are concerned about our port traffic as well. We have a small port.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And these are really big ships. Now, if that model is transported to Dumaguete, you'll have, I don't know how many of these large ships. In fact, if the ports here can't handle those large ships, they'll probably have to go to Cebu to get provisions and whatnot, in which case, a lot of the potential economic um, advantages for Dumaguete might be lost just because they don't have the capacity to serve these ships. Again, I'm not a shipping expert, so I don't know the answer to that, but it is a very good question.
The next question is more on the legal side of things. Uh, the the attendee is asking whether, based on the existing marine protected areas, whether or not there's a legal, this can be a legal framework to challenge the legality to conduct any reclamation activities.
That's a very good. That's a very good question as well. And I'm not an expert on Philippine maritime law. I know that um, there are targets that municipalities should set aside a certain percentage of their marine areas as protected areas, and the ones that will be destroyed because of the island building activity off of Dumaguete City could theoretically just simply, you could just simply declare a marine protected area in a different area in order to replace the ones that are lost. Um, but quite often when you do that sort of activity, you're choosing a less important area because um, areas that were designated off of Dumaguete City were most likely designated by very intelligent marine conservation biologists, by very intelligent marine biologists who chose the area like Bunny Lab because of a specific habitat. Um, and choosing an alternative probably will be a poor replacement. Um, I think that Philippine law is probably not really strict in that regard, so long as you have a certain percentage of your municipal water set aside as a marine protected area, then you probably satisfied the law in the Philippines. But again, I'm basing this on imperfect recollection of Philippine maritime law.
Now, again, in relation to the West Philippine Sea, do they also bring ships with tons of cement that they can use to build the facilities?
Yeah, and all that cement probably originates in uh, People's Republic of China.
Do you have another question, sir? Do you have an idea on how long suspended sediments remain mixed or float on in marine waters?
Yeah, that's also a good question, and a lot of that has to deal with how fine the sediments are. Typically, the dredging activity will have a wide range of sediment sizes. The finer the sediment size, the slower it sinks to the bottom. Of course, that's just a simple, something that's heavier sinks more quickly. And so, if you use land-based um, um, fill for these reclamation areas, quite often you're going to be digging up and using soils that have lots and lots of really fine sediments. And this soil from the land-based fill, I would guess, would be much finer and much stay in the water column much longer than those sediments which originate from a dredger suction cutter.
These questions, sir, I think was also partially answered a while back, but it's more specific. Can you give an estimate number of corals, fishes, or seagrass, etc., that will be killed with this reclamation? Will this also affect the sea life in the coasts of Sibulan, San Jose up to the north, and from Bakong, Darwin to the south? How about Sumilon and Apo Island?
Um, so Sumilan Island is probably too far away unless there's some extreme weather event. Um, uh, Certainly, Sibulan could have certain areas because of the proximity of the land reclamation that will be affected. I would guess that parts of Sibulan will be affected by the land reclamation activity. The municipalities to the south, likely places like Bakong, will have some impacts because of suspended sediments. The further away from Dumaguete City, the less likely, the more proximal to Dumaguete City, the more likely that extreme weather events are going to cause sediments to expand, to float, and damage habitats in the adjacent municipalities.
No, I think the next question has more to do with the materials that will be used. Um, in the construction of this island, do you think they will be purchasing materials from the businesses in the city? For example, cement, steel, etc. Or will they be bringing all their needed materials from China? If so, the businesses won't be getting any income for this. It's more of a question and a reaction at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have a clue. Most likely, um, as they're building the island, they're going to find things that they didn't bring along, if they are bringing most of it along, that they'll need. So maybe obviously, if you're trying to improve your um, economic gain from building an island, you'll want to source your materials from the cheapest possible sources. And my guess would be that carrying them with you from a cheaper source would be more probable than trying to buy them locally. But I don't really know, to tell you the truth. There's still a lot of questions. These are all really good questions, and these are questions that need to be asked when considering um, who, whether or not this activity will actually go forward or not.
Again, a question that asks on the effects on surrounding areas. According to this attendee, you were talking about the Apo Island being unlikely to be hard hit by any plume that might come out of this reclamation. The attendee is asking, what about Sikihor? It's only about 7 or 8 kilometers away from Banilad. Does the plume affect that? As you said, a few kilometers is possible, and some bad weather and currents might bring it there.
Yeah, 7 or 8 kilometers is a long ways away. Um, when you go back to the satellite imagery, you actually see sediment um, um, spreading out. Well, 7 kilometers. Yeah, you could have sediments spreading out 7 kilometers. If I didn't realize Sigihor was so close, but yeah, it could be affected. Um, and again, depends on what materials are being used, whether or not they're going to use land-based or dredging-based materials. It depends on whether or not there's an intersection of any extreme weather events. There are just a lot of big question marks there. Um, all good questions, and I don't have anything but guesses at this point.
Again, a question that might have already been answered, but we're going to ask it anyway, sir. Aren't a large number of coral reef species at risk of extinction globally due to climate change? Would you consider this land replacement project an atrocity simply because of this? Doesn't it violate national laws and international conventions on conservation of threatened species?
Well, the Philippines is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is really a treaty that deals with international waters. However, as a signatory to this treaty, you're essentially acknowledging the fact that um, a protected endangered species should be protected, and B, uh, um, fragile ecosystems need to be protected. It's true, there are species that are threatened with extinction that are off the coasts of Dumaguete. Turtles, for example, are every single sea turtle is considered to be some form of risk of extinction. Um, and you will be destroying their natural habitat. If you do that, the question is, and for lawyers who are more um, attuned to the legalities of following the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in native waters as opposed to international waters, would be able to answer that question more. But in my mind, once you're a signatory of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, you acknowledge that threatened species need to be protected, and there are threatened species that will be affected, and there are fragile ecosystems that will be affected by this activity. And in my mind, if the Philippines just says, okay, go ahead and destroy these reefs, then why did we argue that the China shouldn't be doing it in the West Philippine Sea? If we allow it to happen in our own in the Philippine seas, then why would we argue that China can't do it in the West Philippine Sea? It doesn't make sense to me.
Here's another one. The attendee is asking, or more like reacting. Proponents sell this smart city as a wave protection, perhaps due to storms and sea level rise due to climate change. If true, would that be a worthy investment relative to the destruction of coral reefs and seagrass beds?
Well, think about it. How high are they going to make these reclaimed lands? Are they going to make them several meters above sea level? Um, that's more land that's going to be required. I don't know the answer to that, but most reclaimed land is not really all that high um, and relative to sea level. So if we're thinking about the future in terms of sea level rise and extreme weather events, my question is how long will these reclaimed areas last? One of the biggest questions that came up in the West Philippine Sea case was if you were to simply abandon these islands that were built in the West Philippine Sea, how long would it take for these islands to simply disappear because of raising sea level and because of extreme weather events? Um, um, we don't know the answer to that, but my guess is that it might take, a couple hundred years for those islands to essentially be erased. And in terms of the future for Dumaguete City, how much of the resources of Dumaguete City are going to have to be deployed in order to keep these newly claimed lands intact in face of island of sea level rise and extreme weather events. Think not of just the economic gain from building these islands, but of the economic drain that's going to occur in Dumaguete just in order to keep these reclaimed lands from being gobbled up by the ocean.
This is more of a reaction. It says here, keep in mind that reclaimed land also has the possibility of sinking like the film center in the CCP complex, referring to the CCP complex in Manila. Do you see this as a possibility?
Most definitely. I mean, um, uh, a lot of it depends on how well the engineers actually do their job. Are we sure that they're going to really be thinking about making a fast buck, or are they going to be a fast peso, I should say, or are they going to be really doing their job well? Um, the harder the land that they're going to create, um, more resources that are going to be necessary. Um, but yeah, I agree. There's a very high probability that these lands that are being created will eventually fall apart, or maybe not even be used. When you think about it, 174 hectares added to um, added to Dumaguete, how quickly are they going to be populated by businesses? We don't know the answer to that either. It could be the whole, a lot of the islands, a lot of the reclamation areas is not being used at all. It would just be a, a sink of taxes going away to try to keep them alive, to keep them viable before they sink. I don't know the answer to that. Those are good questions or good reactions that I hadn't even thought about yet. Again, I'm probably a lot more free with my guesses than a lot of people would be, but I think these are good questions to ask.
Yeah, the last one, sir, is more of a reaction. The attendee is saying this is a comment, not a question, but maybe you can react to this. Coral reefs are nurseries for fish. Fish or seafood stocks in the area will certainly be affected. The local fishing industry and the subsistence fishers from the coastal communities will likely be affected by the destruction of the coral reefs, seabed, and marine protected areas brought about by the reclamation project, especially if it is accomplished through dredging. What's your reaction to that, sir?
That's I agree with that 100%. I mean, one of the things that I tried to stress earlier was that environments within an ecosystems are connected. And yeah, open ocean fishes use coral reefs at different periods of their life cycle. Some of them visit on a daily basis, some of them visit on a seasonal basis, some of them visit the coral reefs only once in their life, but they still rely on having that coral reef in order to survive better in their natural habitat, which might be the open ocean or some other habitat. And that comment is very valid. That not only will local fisheries be impacted by this, but potentially far-ranging fisheries will also be impacted by this activity.
All right. So those are all the questions. And thank you, sir, for answering all of them. This has been very informative and eye-opening for all of us. I hope that uh, our viewers and our future viewers who will be looking at the recording of this one would really learn or have learned a lot of out of this talk, especially as we face the ongoing questions raised about the reclamation or island building project. So again, we'd like to thank Dr. Carpenter for lending to us his time. This has been very enriching for all of us, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future, sir. On the in case there would be more seminars or webinars about this topic. So once again, Dr. Carpenter, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Okay,
And
thank you. You did an excellent job translating all those questions to something that I could actually attempt to answer. So thank you, attorney, for a great job as a moderator. And I was pleased to be here tonight.
thank you, sir. And so on behalf of the Dumaguete City host, the Lions Club and Rotary Club of Dumaguete South, thank you all for joining us. We have some announcements. Stay tuned for our next learning event series next week, same time. On August 5, that would be a Thursday. The topic would be on geological impact. This will be shared to us by another expert, Moses Alcala, who is a licensed professional geologist and site remediation professional. On August 9, that would be a Monday, would be Mayor's time, to be done by our own mayor, Honorable Felipe Antonio Birimolio. That would be an opportunity for him to also share his thoughts and his reasons and the rationale for this project, and an opportunity for you to ask him questions. On August 11, would be on human impacts and the current status of the Philippine coral reefs, to be shared to us by Dr. Wilfredo Liquanan, who is a Shore Center Director of DLSU. And of course, on August 12, uh, on the topic Coral Reef Restoration by Dr. Lori J. Raimundo, who is the Director of the University of Guam Marine Laboratory. So once again, thank you very much, friends, viewers, for tuning in to our learning series tonight. Kindly like our FB page, learning event series, and be updated on our upcoming events. The recordings will soon be uploaded on YouTube for future viewings. Now, should you have any advanced questions, just send a message to our FB page. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in tonight, and looking forward to your attendance in our future events. Good evening.